Howdy readers, I'm Jason. This is Chapter and Verse, and this is my, so I've had my channel for just under 2 years now, but this will be my first ever best and worst reading experiences of the year video. I didn't do one of these last year because I had been doing litmus, and one of the litmus prompts one day was, what was the best book you read this year? So I just figured I wouldn't be redundant at the end of the year. Throughout this year, I've tried to be less forthcoming with where books, as I have been finishing them, are kind of falling in the pecking order throughout the year, as far as how they're standing up to the other books that I've been reading this year, because I wanted to make a video like this at the end of the year, and have it be somewhat of a surprise, I suppose, although it probably isn't going to be, as to what appears on the list. So I'm doing a top 5 reading experiences of the year and a bottom 3 reading experiences of the year. And before I get into what the books are, I thought I would just explain a little bit why I'm not doing a top 10. And the reason for that is that I don't read nearly as much as most of the people on BookTube. I'm a really slow reader. And I know I have friends on BookTube who also consider themselves slow readers, but I'm a really slow reader when compared with those people. So to give you some idea, I have read 32 books this year, and counting. I'll be finishing another book this weekend, and then hopefully one more book before the end of the year. So I'll end up at 33 or 34. In 2018, I read 28 books. In 2017, 22 books. 2016, 25 books. 2015, 26 books. 2014, 26 books. 2013, 23 books. 2012, 24 books. And in 2011, I read 33 books, which is possibly where I'm going to land this year. So it's been almost a decade since I have read as much as I'm reading this year. And that is still 2/3 less or 3/4 less than many of the rest of you are reading. So that's why I do a top 5 instead of a top 10. I just don't have the volume of books to justify doing a top 10. Anyway, so before we get to the stuff I really loved this year, let's talk just a little bit about the 3 books that I really did not like this year. So number 3 in my least favorite reading experiences of the year was The Tragedy of Arthur by Arthur Phillips. There was a lot that was right with this book. The book contains what is purported to be a lost Shakespeare play about King Arthur, and it has the play itself in the novel, like as part of the novel, right? It's the last, 70 pages of the book or something. And as far as Shakespearean pastiche goes, right, as far as a kind of faux Shakespeare play goes, it's really quite good. It's a better Shakespeare play than the weakest Shakespeare plays that I've read, if that makes sense. But the novel part of it, right, the part narrated by Arthur Phillips, the novelist, in which we find out about the provenance of the play, in which there are all these questions about whether or not it's authentic. The novel part of it was done so poorly, it was just making me tear my hair out. I hated so much about the fiction 2/3 of the book that it lands on this list, which is a crying shame, because it's one of the best ideas for a novel I've ever heard of. And if it had been done as well as I wanted it to be done, it would be near the top of my best reading experiences of the year. But it didn't get there by any stretch of the imagination for me. The second book on my worst reading experiences of the year is Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi. I've ranted about this book elsewhere. I will link to that video down below. So if you want to see me rake Freshwater over the coals, click on the link below. And then my last worst reading experience of the year, this was the only one that the library actually had in right now, so I went to the library so I'd have something to show you. I certainly don't own this book and will never own this book. But the worst book I read this year by a country mile was An American Marriage by Tayari Jones, chosen by Oprah Winfrey for her book club. It also won the Women's Prize for Fiction, which has to be maybe the worst choice for a literary prize that I can think of, actually. I mean, Amsterdam by Ian McEwan won the Booker Prize, and that's a really bad book as well, but it's nowhere near as bad as this. This book is just laughable, really. And I talk about it in the same video in which I talk about Freshwater. So again, if you want to revisit or for the first time experience me just ranting about An American Marriage and why it's just so god-awful, the link to that video is below. It actually just gets worse in my memory the longer I live with it in my memory. So that's An American Marriage. Now to the good stuff. So number 5, I was debating about putting off this video because right now I'm reading Lila by Marilynne Robinson as a buddy read with Mark from Words Everywhere. And I've got about 60 pages to go in Lila. I was going to make this video yesterday, and then I thought, you know, Lila might end up sliding into the number 5 spot on this list, so I should wait. But I've read enough of the book now, probably 3/4 of the book now, if not more than that, that I can tell I'm not going to like it more than I liked I Married a Communist by Philip Roth. It's my number 5 book of the year, and it is so, God, it's just so assured. It's completely assured. You know, from page 1, if not page 1, then certainly page 2, that you are in the hands of just a masterful prose stylist. And beyond that, beyond just how brilliant the writing is, he's just so perceptive about American history and the ways in which I suppose history kind of echoes down through the decades, right? You know, these events that happen, you know, whether it's Joe McCarthy and his witch hunts or what have you, they are stones falling into the water that is, one might say, American identity. And Roth does such a brilliant job of tracing the ripples, of following the ripples from those events through subsequent decades. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. It is not as accomplished as American Pastoral, but it's magnificent, and it has me really wanting to read The Human Stain now, which is the 3rd book in the so-called American trilogy. My number 4 book of the year is something that I don't have a copy of here with me, but it is the play Wit by Margaret Edson, which I read for my mortality project. You Carry a Coffin Today. It's so moving and it's so insightful about so many things, but I think primarily about the loneliness that someone can feel at the end of their life, especially if that life had been an existence that was earmarked with brittleness and a kind of icy veneer. The main character in this play, who's dying of cancer, had been a poetry academic and just the kind of teacher that students feared rather than loved or respected, I suppose, or maybe respected and admired. But I mean, everything was at a remove. She never let people in, and so here at the end of her life, there's this, I don't know, there's just this kind of heartbreaking loneliness to the whole thing, and the play is it's just deeply profound about loneliness, about isolation, about illness, about treatment, about the institution of medicine, and what it can look like, and what it too often does look like, unfortunately. But yeah, so if you haven't read Wit, it's really short. It's probably, I don't know, 90 pages long or something like this. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. All right, so my number 3 reading experience of the year is not a book itself, but rather a poem in a book of poetry that I read. And the book is Incarnadine by Mary Szybist, and I'm probably mispronouncing her last name. This won the National Book Award for poetry the year it was published, and the book itself is quite good. But as is the case with short story collections, collections of poetry, essay collections, very rarely do those collections end up being home runs across the board, right? Because you're judging the individual parts, and some of the poems in this book just don't really work very well. Many of them are beautiful, but there's one in particular that is one of the best things I've ever read, and so it had to be on this list. And that poem is How Not to Speak of God. So this poem reminds me a lot of Anne Sexton's poem, O Ye Tongues, if any of you are familiar with that. But here's the thing, right? So the structure of this poem, as I just showed you, so it's like a sun, really, right? And there's no beginning and there's no end, but you don't really think about that until you're reading the poem. So you just choose a spot, right? And then you literally, like, you turn the book and you just read your way through it. And I'm going to do that for you guys right now. I'm gonna read the poem to you, and I'm just going to choose a spot at random. So this is a poem that it's about characteristics of God, it seems to me. How not to speak of God, who has tried to reach us, who will do anything to reach us, who is enough, who is more than enough, who should be extolled with our sugared tongues, who knows us in our burnished windshields as we pass, who remembers the honey-colored husks of the locust, who knows the scent of dust, the scent of each sparrow, whose shadow does not flicker under streetlights, who can feel without exaggerating anything, who will care when the iridescent flies swarm toward us, who shall be as the wings of the dove, its coppery shadows, who waits in the midst of the mosquitoes, who devoured the fruit of our ground, the skin of the overripe pears, who saw the world incarnadine, the current flowing, whose face is electrified by its own light, who could be a piece of flame, a piece of mind shimmering, who can feel without eroticizing everything, who will pity us when the bees disappear into their shadows, who loves the dank earth, its wolves and its tigresses, who has tried to reach us, who will do anything to reach us, who is enough, who is more than enough, who should be extolled with our sugared tongues, who knows us in our burnished windshields as we pass, who remembers the honey-colored husks of the locust, and so on. What I find so profound about this poem, so every line of it, it seems to me, is absolutely beautiful. It's just really genius. But the structure of the thing, it comes to feel like a prayer. It comes to feel like one is praying the rosary or something like this, right? It's a Mobius strip. There's no beginning, there's no end. So you can start it anywhere and you can just read your way around it and you can keep going, right? It can come to feel like a kind of incantation. And you feel like you can read it as long as you need to. When I first read it, I read it while I was exercising, and it's probably not ideal, but it caught me so off guard. You know, I was so consumed just with the beauty of the lines and with the turning of the book, that I wasn't anticipating coming back to the line with which I began the poem. And so when I read that line again, it almost just took my breath away. And the meaning of the poem, the meaning behind its structure, which, let's face it, could have felt like a gimmick. I mean, it just like the other shoe dropped. I mean, it just dawned on me that she wasn't merely writing a poem with this piece, but she was consciously and in a very sophisticated way looking at that border, that kind of hazy boundary between poetry and prayer, in a way that I had never really seen done so effectively before. So, How Not to Speak of God by Mary Szybist from the book Incarnadine. My number 2 book of the year is Fire Sermon by Jamie Quatro. I talked about this book in that same video where I raped an American marriage in Freshwater over the coals. I read all 3 of these for the BookTube Prize judging this year. And so if you're curious to hear me extolling the virtues of Fire Sermon, I do a little bit of that in that video. So again, check out that video below. But this is a novel, just in short, this is a novel that explores and treats the subject matter of marriage and religious faith and desire in ways more complicated than I have seen in quite some time. It's interesting, right? Because I'm reading Marilynne Robinson's Lila right now, which is also about marriage, and it's about religious faith. And as good as that book is, and it is, it's not as good as Fire Sermon. It's not as accomplished, which is really saying something, because Marilynne Robinson is probably America's greatest living writer on religion, especially on religion in fiction, using novels as a vehicle. But Jamie Quatro, I don't know, maybe she's the heir to Marilynne Robinson. Maybe she's going to pick up that mantle, once Marilynne Robinson has hung up her pen, so to speak. But anyway, this is a tremendous book. And then the very best book that I read this year was also the very first book that I read this year, and that is Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. And I really just don't have any words for this. This book is stylistically daring. It is kind of weirdly funny at times. It is spooky, and it is just deeply moving. And it's just a great surprise. I'm not sure what I expected when I read this. I had never read any of Saunders' short stories, for which he's most famous. I knew it had won the Booker, and that there had been maybe a little bit of controversy about that. But yeah, I read this at the beginning of the year, and it set a gold standard for the rest of the year that nothing else lived up to. So it's kind of weird when that happens. But if you haven't read Lincoln in the Bardo, you should. You may hate it. Some of my dear friends don't like it. My wife doesn't like it. But I think it's a work of just I don't know, just kind of white fire genius, really. And I can't wait to see what George Saunders does next with the novel form. So. But that's it. Those were my best and worst reading experiences of the year. If you have read any of these, I'd love to hear your thoughts on them in the comments below. Maybe you can persuade me to change my mind about any of the 3 travesties that I included. Maybe not, but you never know, right? Unless you leave a comment and we engage in dialogue. So I hope all of you have had a really wonderful holiday season, whatever you do for the holidays, whether you're celebrating Christmas or Hanukkah, and in whatever way, or if you're not celebrating in any way, shape, or form. I hope it has been a really beautiful end of the year for you guys. So I will see you again very soon. Adios.